So we're going to have a great discussion today on this episode of Things Hidden. I'm joined by Luke Burgis, who's a professor, and he's also the author of the new book, Wanting, which is an exploration of mimetic desire. And if you're listening to this podcast, that we really like that topic here. So welcome to the program, Luke.
Thanks for having me on, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great having you on. And I got to listen to your book on audio, and I really enjoyed it. I thought you did a great job, introducing these ideas to a general audience, and kind of bringing it into that bringing Rene Girard into that kind of that's, kind of the self-help space and trying to figure out how to get your life in order. And I saw how you kind of, you engaged Jordan Peterson a little bit there, just a little touch of that, just to reference that style of thinking. And so I thought you did a great job. So congratulations on the book.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah. And I have to say, the same goes to you. I think we're trying to do something similar. And you've been an advocate for the thought of Rene Girard long before I ever was. And I've enjoyed your work. So I think we're going to have an interesting chat today. Yeah.
So let's start at when did you get into, mimetic theory originally, in your life before we get to the book content? How did you get into Rene Girard?
It would have been about 8 years ago now. I describe an experience that I had in the preface of the book where I walked away from a startup that I'd founded and sort of did some spiritual seeking. And it was in that period of my life, I seriously was discerning a radical vocational change. I thought I may be called to the priesthood, in fact, and explored that route. Went back to school, studied philosophy and theology. And it was during that time, in that first year of having stepped away from my company, that I was introduced to Girard by a wise old Jesuit priest, actually. And I immediately realized it was big, and it's probably going to take me years to really wrap my head around it. And that's, of course, what has happened. I'm still doing that. Yeah. So that's how I was originally introduced to him.
Very good. So you said 8 years ago?
I think it was about 8 years ago. Yeah.
That's awesome. So now, did you grow up in the church or the faith, or how did you, what was your background in understanding the kind of Christian and spiritual framework of what you were later discovered intellectually with Girard?
Yeah, I'm a Christian. I was raised culturally Catholic. My parents weren't that serious about the faith. And then, of course, when I shouldn't say of course, because it gives it an air of inevitability, and it's certainly not. But when I went away to college, oldest story in the book, I went to NYU, New York City, was running around during college and for a few years after college where, I might have went to mass, a handful of times, Christmas and Easter for sure. So maybe more than a handful of times. But certainly wasn't a big part of my life. So, but I did have I had some foundations. I certainly had cultural foundations. And I came back to the church in my late 20s and was introduced to Girard shortly after that. So I think the theological perspective, and I went deep into philosophy and theology, and I think that's actually what gave me the lens to appreciate the depth of Girard's thought. If it would have just been, here's how I can understand mimesis in the markets, I don't think I would have been as powerfully attracted to it. It was the theological side of things that I realized was very important.
Yeah, some people have kind of, in some slightly dismissive way, compared Girard as like the Christian the youth group kids version of Nietzsche. It's what, people who want to still listen to Christian music and be cool, they get to Girard instead of going too far off into Nietzsche or the French postmodernists.
Yeah, because you can engage with Girard at a variety of levels, right? You can engage with Girard in a non-threatening way, in sort of the self-help way, and you can do that. And he's kind of got something for everybody, right? Right. Yeah.
So when you set out to write this book, what did you want to accomplish?
Well, you said at the beginning, I did. It's funny, I have a theological background and I'm a Christian, but I was intentional about not trying to do too much in the book itself. Very hard for an author or an artist to do, because like your temptation, your inclination is basically to throw everything that you got into this thing, right? Like, I'm going to flex my intellectual muscle. I'm going to go deep into theology. I'm going to hit everybody with all this, stuff. And that would have been a mistake. I think that would have been a mistake, because that's why we're having this conversation right now. I saw that there something was missing, and it was kind of an introduction that people could wrap their heads around, that engage with popular culture. People know Jordan Peterson, people know Zappos, they know. So I was trying to just I talk about sports, right? So I was just trying to give people some cultural context for Girard. And I don't, I have a whole chapter dedicated to the scapegoat mechanism. So it's not like I ignored it. But I was careful about how I got there. And it's been cool to see that the book is opening up a lot of interesting questions. The funniest thing for me as an author is I have people who read the book and write me these long emails, and they're like, you should really consider becoming a Christian. Like, so many of the things that you're saying in this book are just, wow, you really seem like you. And I'm like, in a way that means that I probably sort of accomplished what I was trying to do. In the sense that this was a book with a major publisher for a large general audience, but all of the things are in there if you read carefully.
Yeah, and that's something that I've wrestled with a lot as I've tried to explain, my approach to, I see Rene Girard's theory as like a major piece of my toolkit of what I'm trying to tell the public, and I often wrestle with how much do you explicitly how much explicitly do you talk about the Jesus part of it, and how much do you leave it unspoken? You've got the C.S. Lewis quote, paraphrasing basically, that, there's no such thing as a, humanities science textbook. I mean, a humanist science textbook where you open it up and it's talking about humanism. It's just undergirding the framework. And that's in a very attractive way of positioning it. But then, with some aspects of Girard's stuff, as you point out in the book, you have to wrestle with the gospel. And I don't think we should shy away from that. And so it's a balancing act, because if you put so much on it with the Jesus stuff, immediately people are so hardwired to shut down with listening to people because of their preconceived notions about Jesus. But at the end of the day, people need to reconcile. They need to reckon with this figure, whether they believe he's just a man or not. I tell people, if he's just a man, it's a greater miracle what he accomplished in some sense, because a mere mortal could do this and have this big of an impact, as Girard demonstrates in his work, Yeah,
I mean, it all comes down to a fundamental decision about the person of Jesus Christ. It all comes down to that. I think what Girard has done is he's done an anthropological reading of the scriptures. And you can stay on the level of anthropology. And I think that it did open up a fascinating new layer and perspective with which to read the scriptures for me. But it's not only anthropological. And I think he's right. I think that was missing from a lot of the theological analysis. What does this say about man? But you can't understand man without understanding his relationship to God. So it can never be divorced from the theological questions of everything from creation theology, which I think there's a lot to be said about creation theology in Girard. Like Girard helped me understand original sin, in a profound way. This idea of like deviated desires, right? Like disordered desires. So there's a whole Augustinian kind of angle to that. So I mean, Girard ultimately forces the question of forces a choice. He forces a choice, right? You've called your show that a neighbor's choice, and I think the word choice is a really important word, because freedom is implied in that word, and it forces a choice about the person of Christ, and it forces a choice about how we respond to our neighbor, which are not separate things.
And Girard is, in some places, he says we need to be careful to distinguish the Christian approach versus an ideological approach or philosophical approach, because he says that the Christian approach does present a radical choice. Could you explore that a little bit, the idea of the difference between how philosophy and ideology doesn't really want you to think about the radical choice? It wants you to just submit to the guru, who's telling you this is what you got to think. But Jesus makes you question and wrestle with things. He doesn't just tell you, try to keep up. I'm the grand master of history. That's what a lot of philosophers and politicians and ideologues do,
Yeah, it's the cult of experts. That's a phrase that Girard coined. With the collapse of any kind of transcendent models, we've turned to the cult of experts. They're the people we go to. And, I think I sort of sense a new Gnosticism in the air, kind of salvation by knowledge alone, right? By reason alone. There's a lot of smart people out there, right? Using big words and referencing fancy names and philosophers and dropping Deleuze in Twitter chats and stuff like that. It's like, most people have never heard of these people, first of all, and sometimes we can get so caught up in trying to like solve the problem of what's wrong with the world right now. And we all sense like something's not right, and everybody's trying to weigh in and give hot takes about diagnosing the problem and trying to fix the problem. But we have to think seriously about the limits of that, like the limits of reason and the limits of trying to engineer a solution, especially from the top down, right? That would just be an absolute disaster. One way to think about this because at the end of the day, Christianity is about a relationship, right? With a person. It's not about just knowing everything you possibly can about Christianity. It's a relationship with the person of Jesus Christ. And if you go back to the biblical roots, the knowing and the loving, the knowing and the relationship are not separate things. They go hand in hand. Because if you don't know them, you don't have a relationship with them, you can't know them, is what I meant to say. And then we can go down ideological pathways where we try to kind of a false Christianity where, let's just a hypothetical example, right? There's a lot of, scarcity in the world. 1 in 6 children are hungry. We have an energy crisis. Imagine if we solved all of those problems. Imagine if, I built a machine or there's some brilliant entrepreneurs that solve the problem of scarcity. Nobody was hungry. There was cheap energy. Everybody had everything that they need. And we lived in some kind of Marxist utopia or something like that, right? Because that is ideology. It's almost like, it's like Christianity that wants to outdo Christianity in a sense, right? In that world, we imagine that people would be happy or something, right? And like there'd be no rivalry left. Yeah. I would even say not only would there, one way to think about it is, would there be less rivalry than there is today? I would go so far as to say, I think I could make the case that there might even be more. There might even be more, because now I have less time to work and try to fulfill sort of like my basic needs. And I can spend all day looking at my fellow human beings. I mean, you think identity politics is bad now, like imagine what it would be like then. We'd all be standing around arguing, about the shape of people's noses or something, right? Like there's a principle of rivalry at the heart of human relations that Girard gets at, and we're not going to eliminate that. Like sin, right? We're not going to eliminate some of those tendencies merely by giving people material goods and eliminating material scarcity. That's not what it's about. So that's the ideological approach, and I think there's a lot of pride in that way of thinking. And Christ forces us to to confront something that's more radical that we're never going to be able to solve with merely economic policies alone.
Well, that's interesting, because let's unpack that a little bit, because there's a lot there that we could think about. So I agree with you on that, but there's a balance in some ways that we have to walk, because if we go too into the because I get the ideological part, but then there's the whole point of like what Jesus spent most of his time doing is healing people physically. That's a material there's a healing taking place. It's dealing with matter, right? And it's almost like those healings that he does are a down payment on the kingdom of heaven coming, right? And like here's more to come, but this is a start. And so, and then I'm thinking how that fits in with like Peter Thiel's approach to applying Girard to this idea that we need to create wealth, and we need to try to alleviate the effects of dire scarcity in different parts of our lives, such that we don't create that zero-sum pressure cooker environment where people are going to hunt for scapegoats. But as you mentioned, the other extreme is if we solved all the problems, maybe we'd fight more rivalry, more rivalrous conflict than ever before. Lunchroom drama would flourish. And it's a weird yin yang kind of paradox, right? Because I tell that I say politics is lunchroom drama on my show. And I say, if we If we want to get serious, we're going to stop fighting over who's sitting at whose table, and we're going to solve problems together. Let's get rid of heart disease. Let's get rid of cancer. But you're right. If we go too far there, then we're just in utopia. So where's the balance there with that?
Well, I think it's a both and, right? And you're pointing out, we can't have a dualism about this question, right? It's both and. I'm an entrepreneur, right? I mean, I believe that creating wealth is good, right? And I want to solve the problems of the world. I'd love to be able to eliminate hunger. But at the same time, I realize that that's not, we're not going to build the kingdom of heaven right on earth, right? I think like through our work, we're called to sanctify the world and to build it up and to, to heal, right? And that's important, but it's not everything. I mean, so one way to think about this is actually to offer a counterpoint to the, what if we lived in utopia where there was no scarcity? It's often said in Girardian circles that, given a long enough time horizon, sort of negative mimesis or rivalry like always happens. I don't know if I don't think that's true, actually. I mean, I can imagine, because if we say that that's true, it's kind of denying that people can live faithfully as Christians in this world. I mean, I imagine, you have a set of, people that go to live as monks in a monastery or something like that. It's not inevitable that they're just going to like devolve, into some kind of mimetic rivalry given enough time, right? So I don't think that that's true, but I think in a worldly sense, I mean that's people living a Christian existence, right? United to Christ. I think we have to say that it's possible to do that, but in the worldly sense, where the world has rejected Christ and basically from the public sphere. I think it's always going to tend towards that.
So in that vein, then, should we work towards a project, obviously taking different tactics along the way about how we get that ball rolling down the lane or whatever, but should we work towards a project where Jesus can come back into the public square and not be considered, oh, that's a religious little niche? It's like, no, this is someone you need to reconcile with. You need to reckon with this. And you need to wrestle with, the most brilliant man in history, at the very least, if not God himself. But is that what needs to have? Because some people say, there's a liberal type Girardian thought that says, no, Jesus will conquer even if he's metaphysically totally out of fashion, but we will imitate the aesthetic and the ethic of Christ, even if people are not, they're still functionally secular. But I don't agree with that. I think there does need to be a kind of explicit confrontation with Christ back into the civic realm again in some way. Not that it's going to be governments, theocratic or something like that.
I agree with you. I know. I think that, I don't know if we're going to have a Christendom again,
right.
But I agree with you, and I think that that's worth fighting for. I think we have to fight for that. And I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah.
I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm not in politics. I don't know what that looks like. But, I certainly try to do it in the small little world that I'm in. Right. Whether it's conversations with friends or colleagues or, totally secular people. You do a very good job at this, right? I mean, you bring it back to the person of Christ and having like that. It's really important to do that. And I mean, I think we can do that on the micro level, you and I and other followers of Christ. How that happens at a broader level, I'm not sure. I don't believe that we can just like read Girard and, build a society that just kind of like tips its hat to Christianity and acknowledges, we recognize victims. I mean, in fact, it doesn't often even recognize that this comes from Christianity, but right. It can't just be like a tip of the hat, thanks Christianity. It's got to be like a radical reckoning and choice, right? It's very clear in the Gospels. And I'm not sure how to do that on the level of, the nation. But I think, little by little that leaven, that mustard seed can spread. And I mean, hope is an important thing to have here for a Christian. We can't throw in the towel.
Yeah. And just to stay on that political line just for a moment, is I think that that's one of the things I see what Girard provides is kind of like an apologetics. It's a way of bringing almost a kind of apologetics into the political and news conversation, and you can, not that that's the main attempt of what I'm trying to do, but it has a natural apologetic kind of thing where it's like you enter into people's space, you enter into the gods of our time, which is this political debate and ideologies, and then you can show how Christ kind of resolves or at least provides a way out of the hell of mimetic conflict for power, right? And that's one of the things I've tried to introduce to folks who tend to be in the conservative circles or so forth. They're a little bit more open to listening to these kind of ideas right now. I mean, that could change later on. The left might be more open later. I don't know. But just this idea that you don't win by grabbing for the same object of power. And you don't win. I hear this a lot on the right. We need to be more like the left. They're just cutthroat. They're cutthroat. They don't play by the rules. They win. They just beat. We got to beat them. And I'm thinking, no. Don't do that. It's going to get worse and worse if you do that. Let's look at Jesus here. And a lot of people in the conservative movement kind of see Christianity as like luggage on a traveling, like, we really like the Christian part of this. This is part of our little vacation, list of things to bring on the journey. But it's like, no, this is not just an ideology here. This is a real reckoning with the concept of power and coercion. And you need to tread lightly here instead of just trying to glue Christianity onto some Constantinian style. It's not going to work. I mean, we had 2,000 years to look at that. It doesn't work.
No, exactly. One of my mentors, Arthur Brooks, he said one time, he goes, go where you're not invited and say unexpected things. And he said, that's what I try to do. Right?
Yeah.
Like, you enter the public square, public engagement, whether you're invited or not, and you say unexpected things. So, the media, the mainstream media, at least, like they haven't quite been able to figure out even how to talk about cancel culture. Right? They don't have the language even. Right. I mean, I think I've heard the word scapegoat a couple of times, maybe. Certainly not with the level of understanding of a Girardian, but like that's like just to give you like one example. Like people are not even hearing the way that this mechanism, right, which we would call like a satanic mechanism, is actually working. And there's an opportunity there to engage this issue by talking about these things. But that's not easy. Believe me, I've tried. And it's something that they don't really want to wrestle with. But I'm going to continue to try. I know you are, because that's an example of, hey, this is something that we need to look at, and we can't be scared to look at it, right? Our own violence, our own, as a society, as people. The challenge of talking about Girard, the challenge of writing a book about mimetic theory, is that it's not, it should make you uncomfortable, should make people uncomfortable if they're doing a good job of examining themselves, right? And self-defense mechanisms go up immediately. As if I asked, first thing that Peter Thiel told me when I talked to him, he was like, people have all kinds of defense mechanisms, psychological, spiritual, ideological, political. And, one of the things I think when Girard is communicated well, he can tend to help people put down the defense mechanisms in the beginning. But if you go all the way, it forces you to confront questions like, the person of Christ, and the hard sayings, right, in the Gospels. And, and we know that many people left him, at various times. And, to whom else should we go? I mean, that's the bottom line, right?
And that's the interesting thing about when you're trying to talk about the truth of Jesus, and you're doing it in a media landscape, whether you're publishing a book or a podcast or whatever, is that the whole notion of media as a profession is that you've got to get numbers up to some degree to be able to keep doing it, right? I mean, you sell books or get clicks or downloads. And how do you teach the hard truths of Christ when the harder the truth is in Christ's life, the smaller the crowd is? So it's a real conundrum there, and I know churches face this problem too, right? Oh, we want to have numbers because then we can look at all we can do. We can save the people in missions trips. We can build a poverty program and a kitchen and all the things we can do, keep kids out of crime by having Xbox time and Saturday nights and stuff. And they came up with all these ideas, but then it becomes a business, and then it becomes about the crowd. And then, as Soren Kierkegaard would say, the crowd is a lie. And that chasing after the crowd ends up inhibiting the raw truth of the gospel that, people want to originally present,
Yeah. I mean, there's a fundamental tension at the heart of talking about this stuff. We see it on social media. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of pressure. I mean, it rewards, let me put it this way. It provides a strong incentive for, not speaking the truth. Or for phrasing things in a more salacious way or in a more radical way, because the algorithms reward that. Things tend to go viral. I mean, some very important truths about the faith, some very important anthropological truths, seem dull on the surface compared to like some of the more sort of memeable kind of phrases that you could use, right? So there's a fundamental tension at the heart of this. And like, what do? Do we just turn the message of the gospel then into memes? Right? No, I think that's certainly the wrong approach, but I think people are trying to figure out the question: how are you a faithful Christian that still engages the culture and the media, without losing your soul, or without bending the truth, without watering it down, or without lying?
I mean, that's one of the reasons why, people, when you're in media, they always say, oh, you got to be on all the social media platforms. And the one they really want to look at is Twitter. And I've just never engaged directly with Twitter. From early on, I kept looking at that thing saying, this thing doesn't feel right. And then as I got into Girard, I said, this feels like walking into a mob and squawking, just like birds are just walking in the middle of a crowd and going, can anybody hear me? And then it's like, what is this madness? This is a madhouse. And I know that there's great stuff there, and I get it. And I use Twitter as a news source sometimes to look at, what breaking little thing. But, the idea of going in there, that's a hard thing. I almost wonder if it's just a fundamentally, not just Twitter, but that seems to be the worst in its immediate little snippy attitude. It just feels fundamentally satanic to be in there,
Yeah. I mean, I've been on Twitter. I've deleted my account 5 times since 2008 when I first got on the platform. I got on it for a company that I was running, and I was one of the first people on it. The Wall Street Journal interviewed me. They were like, oh, how are you using Twitter to engage with your customers? And at the time it was brand new, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like one of my customers can just tweet at me and I can just reply to them. It's like customer service on steroids. This is great. It didn't take me very long when I would just go on there, and I was like, why? It was so I feel depressed after I scroll Twitter for like more than 10 minutes. What's going on here? So I got off of it, and I got back on, and I got off of it, and I got back on essentially for my book.
That's the push pull, right?
That's the push pull, man. That's the push pull. And there are some people out there, like Lex Friedman is somebody that comes to mind, who's like, I'm going to build social media that is about love and serves humanity. And I mean, I hope he does. I just don't know how. I'm not quite sure how you do it. Given what we know about mimesis, I don't know if there's a technological solution to that. I mean, I think that Peter Thiel would say, I think that technology can help mitigate some problems, right? Like some mimetic violence, but I don't know if anybody's going to be able to build a social media platform around love. I mean, I don't know if anybody finds out how to do that. I mean, man, that'd be something else, right?
I mean, that's just speaking in the realm of talk radio. I went into that industry knowing that, its reputation of being loud and calling names like a, carnival style, that's the old school Americana, carnival barker style populism of talk radio. And I wanted to introduce a different kind of experience on talk radio where instead of saying that Democrats, you would have a person call in live from federal prison for a first-time nonviolent offense and reunite them with their wife on the other end and talk about what life was like and what their favorite movies were like and what they want to do if they could be free. And fly their plane again before they went to prison for 20 years. Just giving those human interest stories in the medium like talk radio, where it's all about fight, election, and it's been interesting. I mean, I don't know, the jury's still out on where my adventure in that medium goes, but it's true that just like with Twitter, when you're on there, it makes you feel negative. And I've noticed that about news media on TV and a lot of radios, that even if you're listening to someone you agree with, the format is to always talk about the problems, and you feel negative. You feel hopeless. You feel apathetic. You feel scared. You feel anxious. You feel angry. And I think it's okay to feel those feelings, but I wanted to, my approach has been at least try to give people some positivity, some hope, and not just like America's still the great country. No, give people specifics. Give something that they can tangibly work on in their life, or, nudge them in a direction that can give them some positive steps that they can take. And I think you've tried to do that with your book too, where you try to give people steps, to move away from being caught up in the matrix of envy and covetousness, right?
Yeah, exactly. But that's a challenge, because there's a strong incentive in publishing, just like there is in media, to throw red meat to one side or the other. Because it sells a lot of books, it gets a lot of viewers and listeners on talk radio and media. Gerard said partisanship, is basically just choosing the same scapegoat as everybody else, and it's powerful to operate according to scapegoats, because it binds people together. It gives them a sense of group identity. If you're a radio talk show host and you go on there just like blasting one side every single day, and you're essentially basically making a scapegoat, and it's a powerful way to build an audience. I'm not saying you should do it. So that is there. I mean, there's not there's not I'm just thinking to myself right now off the top of my head, I don't know if I could name a really popular like centrist sort of like talk radio show out there, right? You got like Red Scare, and you got stuff on there, and like, isn't it interesting, right? Like everything seems to kind of like be moving to the extremes, and there's not a lot of room for, and I'm not advocating centrism, okay? Because sometimes, right, isn't it interesting though, right? Like there's very few people that are willing to go on there and talk about the nuances and talk about the challenges, because they know that they're just going to be pissing everybody off, right? And they're not providing that like unifying bond, right? Like we all agree on what the problems are here, right? Like how dare I, sort of challenge our group orthodoxy, and that's something that I'd love to see that problem not be exacerbated, and I hope a space opens up for people that are willing to do that. And I think that you do a great job.
Yeah. So let's talk about the book a little bit, the fundamentals, like mimetic desire. What is mimetic desire, the way you frame it? Just for folks who are new to this, if they're popping into this podcast, that's a very Girardian podcast, but you never know. Yeah,
you never know. Mimetic desire means that we don't desire an object based on the inherent or objective qualities merely of that object itself, but that there's a model, a third person, a third group that mediates our desire for that object. So desire itself is not object oriented the way that we assume that it is. There's not a direct line between us and the things that we desire. There are models that mediate desire for us. I think there's an exception to that. Girardians can disagree on this. I don't know where you fall on this, David. Like, is all desire mimetic? I think I could make a pretty strong theological case that, there's such a thing as kind of a direct intervention of actual grace that can ignite desire, and it doesn't require a mediator. That's my opinion.
And inspiration, right? Like,
yeah. But in for the most part, in this world, we rely on mediators of desire, which challenges this idea of our desires coming from our autonomous kind of imperial self, that we generated ex nihilo. So that's basically what it means, that the nature of desire is social.
And you get into all kinds of examples in the book. You talk about, I like the story of Ferrari. That was interesting. Could you tell a little bit about that? That was an interesting story. I learned about how he didn't want to build a sports car, right? Or was that Lamborghini that didn't want to? I get them mixed up.
Lamborghini didn't want to build a sports car.
Yeah.
He was a tractor manufacturer in Italy, very successful one. And, was so successful, he'd made himself a good amount of money. So he owned some Ferraris, more than one, in fact. And he was driving his favorite Ferrari around. This is in the early 60s, and kept throwing out the clutch on his Ferrari. So for younger listeners, if you don't know what a clutch is or how to drive a stick, there's a lot of ways to throw out a clutch. I've done it before. In the middle of nowhere in Spain. It's not fun. Your car doesn't go anywhere. And he kept throwing out the clutch in his Ferrari. And he eventually, had his tractor mechanics open up the hood of his car, look at the clutch, and he saw that in the Ferrari, they were using kind of a piece of crap clutch that, he had in his own warehouse. And he ended up replacing it with a better clutch, one of the ones that went on one of his really sturdy tractors, and, fixed the problem. And, here Ferrari was charging an arm and a leg for the same part. And Lamborghini had it in his tractor factory the whole time for, 90% discount. And while he was in the car, he souped it up and made some other changes. And it ended up being a better Ferrari than the kind that you could get straight out of the Ferrari warehouse. He finally went and confronted Enzo Ferrari and said, look, you sold me this car. It's got a bad clutch in it. And Enzo Ferrari laughed him out of the building and said, let's go back to making tractors. Right. So, Lamborghini was sort of inflamed by this rivalry with Ferrari, Enzo Ferrari, who at the time was famous. He won all the major, car races. And Lamborghini went back to his warehouse and said, we're going to get into the automobile business. He, went to Detroit. He went to Japan. He researched how to make cars, how to set up a factory. And he considered himself, I don't know if I mentioned this in the book or not, but he said, I'm just a great imitator. I imitate the best of what's come before me. I don't invent anything new. And which is not true, because Lamborghini was different. And he ended up producing, within 2 years, he produced a great sports car that outdid Ferrari in many ways. And I think last year, 2020 was Lamborghini's highest sales year yet. So he's still going strong.
But wasn't it true that he didn't want to build a sports car while he was alive? He always wanted to build something besides sports cars? Or?
No, it wasn't that he didn't want to build the sports cars. He never wanted to get into the racing business.
Okay.
So he knew,
because he knew that was mimetic, right?
He knew that was his only reason for racing would be to beat Enzo Ferrari. And he said, I'm not going to get into the racing business while I'm alive. And he actually wrote into his company statutes and bylaws that Lamborghini would not be able to do that, codified it, which is interesting. I know that they are now, and I'm not sure what changed or how that happened. I guess he passed away, and the board probably voted, and because that's a lucrative industry to be in, the racing business. But he was so adamant about it that he took steps to prevent that. And I thought that was, I've ran across a story in a book in Italy that's only in Italian. And I was like, wow, I'd never heard this before. Because it was written by his son, Tonino Lamborghini. This is kind of the untold backstory. And Tonino, his son, said, my dad saw how toxic the rivalry with Enzo Ferrari was and where it would end if he didn't stop. It would either end in somebody dying, it would end in bad ways. And he goes, he sort of realized this because he was a lifelong fan of bullfighting, and he saw, the way it never ends well for the bull. And he said he saw that happening to himself, and he took steps to prevent it.
And so that you point him out as an example as kind of someone who had a little bit of self-awareness, to have some wisdom in his mimetic desire, and how he, a lot of people don't have that kind of wisdom. It seems like they had a hot rivalry in some ways, but he still had enough foresight to kind of resist going all the way into that,
Right. And I know he was a pretty serious Christian. I don't know, to what extent that played a factor. But he did seem to have just an awareness, a self-awareness of this, a tacit knowledge, I guess we could say, of the negative externalities and the effects of rivalry. Certainly probably never heard the word mimesis in his life, but, you don't necessarily have had to understand right. What the phenomenon, like what mimetic desire is, if you've, had some experience in the world and thought seriously about the way that desire works.
Now, some people who listen to these discussions about desire from Girard's perspective might say, well, that sounds like Buddha. What would you say? How would you explain the difference fundamentally in the Christian and Girard influenced approach to understanding desire and the illusion of desire versus Buddha's critique on desire?
So, the Christian understanding of desire is that, we do have illusions about our desire in the Girardian sense. We assume that our desires are entirely our own, for instance. Girard calls this the romantic lie. We have deviated desires. We desire the wrong things. In a sort of an age of relativism, we have this idea of like, well, whatever people want is what they want. And, who are we to tell them? That's fine, right? If you have a libertarian sort of view, it's like, sure, people can want whatever they want, right? But not everything is good for them. Like from a Christian standpoint, right? Like not all desires are good, right? So from a Christian standpoint, the goal is not to desire less. It's not to eliminate desire. In fact, I want to desire more. I want to desire the kingdom of heaven more. I want to desire God. So it's a matter of rightly ordered desires, which ultimately is at the end of my book, I talk about desire ultimately is another word for love. In the end here, we're talking about love, right? So love and do what you will, in the words of Augustine. In the Buddhist sense, desire is the root of all suffering, for the most part. This is one of the noble truths, and there's it's not a matter of rightly ordered desires. It's a matter of you may know more about Buddhism than I do, but I think there's not the idea of kind of the focus is more on eliminating desires than it is on ordering desires.
Right.
I don't want to misrepresent.
I think that's well said. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a simplified version of it.
Yeah, and I just as you mentioned that, you said that desire is the root of all suffering. And I thought that reminds me of, the Gospel of John chapter 8, I think kind of challenges that notion when they're saying, well, why is this man blind? Is it his sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus doesn't say, yeah, his suffering is rooted because of this person's desire or his desire or his parents' desire. He's blind because I guess I'm paraphrasing, the glory of God is so that I could heal him now, Yeah. That's and so that's kind of a challenge. There's a little bit of a critique there of this idea that, desire is what causes suffering. I think Jesus kind of opens it up to more of mystery, doesn't he?
He does. And, in the 10th commandment, this very mysterious commandment seems to forbid desire itself, right? I mean, on a superficial reading, right? You shouldn't covet anything of your neighbors. It gives this long list, right? And that word covet, that is typically translated in English as covet, in Hebrew means something like desire. You shouldn't desire your neighbor's wife. You shouldn't not desire your neighbor's goods. The commandment is unlike any of the other commandments because it's not prohibiting an act. It's prohibiting it seems like a sweeping type of desire. And the right way to read that commandment is, at least in terms of Girardian perspective, is like it's not prohibiting desire in the Buddhist sense. It's warning humanity about disordered, sinful, covetous, envious, rivalrous desire. And that's a really important distinction to make. We can desire things out of envy or pride and covetousness, or we can desire things because they're true, good, and beautiful. and there's a big difference between the two, and discerning that difference is at the heart, I think, of what it means to be a Christian.
Is pride ever a good desire to have? People talk about taking pride in one's nation when they're being humiliated about, the globalism versus nationhood and all these different things. Is pride ever a good thing, or do you think it's always something we should be very skeptical? I mean, we should, certainly be skeptical of it, but is there a healthy pride, or is that maybe a different word?
I think it might. Well, I mean, the word it's one of these words like kind of like love that it's. I love how the Greeks had 4 words for everything, and we just have one word for it. Right? So I can be proud of my wife or proud of my children, and I'm using it in that sense. Nothing wrong with that, right? I'm proud of my country Pride in the personal sense, though, obviously is dangerous.
Right.
Is dangerous, right? It's kind of the root of all sinfulness,
Right.
in a sense. So that I think, and I don't think I'm not going to say make a sweeping declaration against all pride, but the pride that you and I are talking about, I think, is the kind of pride that makes one is a lack of humility. And causes one not to accept their own kind of creatureliness and limitations, and leads to people doing violence to other people. Right? Pride is the root of asserting my will over and against others out of pride, and not recognizing that they're free people with wills. And there's this kind of will to power battle of the wills, which stems from pride. I mean, if we weren't prideful, why would we feel the need to dominate or lord anything over other people? And that's the problem.
Yeah. And we see that all around us. So much of the suffering of the world is tied to this lie. We can punish you because you don't take a drug. We're not going to let you, some people say you can't go into grocery stores if you don't take what the king has decreed as medicine. You must take it, or you shouldn't be able to go to eat your food. Or you must be a liberal democracy, or we'll spend $2 trillion in decades occupying your people to make you, be kinder to women. It's like, what is this? This is lording over, which is what Jesus forbids,
Yeah. Well, the biblical understanding of authority is different than the worldly understanding of authority.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus says, right, the rulers of this age will lord their power over you, will lord their authority over you. Not so with you. Like, I have come to serve, right? You have authority in order to serve others. And that is the fundamental difference. I mean, the biblical understanding of authority, which is related to power, that power should be at the service of others, not bludgeoning them or coercing them against their will. And very importantly, we're not talking about this a lot these days, but violating another's conscience. Cardinal John Henry Newman famously said, I'll toast to the Pope, but to conscience first. And that's a sacred. The conscience is a sacred sort of center of a person, and violating that is a grave thing.
Well said. But when you look at mimesis, some people say that's a black box that Girard creates. Where do you think it comes from? Is it the mirror neuron thing? You explore that a little bit, and people have talked about that a lot. Where does this desire come from?
Mimesis itself?
Yeah.
Like why is it part of of human nature?
Yeah. Like how do we have it? Why do we have it? Is it mirror? Some people try to make it mirror neurons, and there's other different theories about it. But it's kind of it's just assumed, that Girard just kind of postulates, well, look, this is what we do. We don't have an explanation for why really, but we do it. And then there's a little bit of an explanation with physical, like the mirror neuron thing. But some people say that's not really, as much, the mirror neuron thing is a little bit overblown in terms of an explanation for it.
My understanding of the mirror neuron thing is that it is a little overblown.
Yeah.
Based on my conversations with Dr. Metzoff in the book.
Right.
We know that it exists certainly in the monkeys. It's a little more ambiguous when it comes to humans. I do think there's a physiological substrate for mimesis. I think there's an evolutionary one. Girard talks about this and things hidden. This could be something that humans sort of, developed in the process of hominization. But I think that the most compelling answer for me is a theological one. I think God desired first, right? Is creation theology. Created the world, right, through this abundance of love and desire to communicate it, and created. So that he's the first mover of desire, so to speak. And even within the Trinity itself, right? There's this communication of desire, right? The love between the Father and the Son. Hope we're not getting too theological here.
No, that's perfect. Yeah. Go ahead.
So created the world, and so I view it's not mimetic desire all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
This comes from God, and I don't know. I don't know how else to ground it other than creation theology. And you look at let's say pre-fallen humanity, perhaps desired in a perfectly ordered way, right? Like desired to be in a relationship with God, in a right relationship with one another. They didn't look at each other with lust or with envy, and sin basically just disrupted, and we lost the ability to desire in that pure way. So, we started to desire mimetically in a rivalrous way, in a covetous way, and there was that rupture. So that's the way that I understand it. It's almost as if we started to look to our left and our right, and in our desire just kind of went off in a million different directions. And the theological principle of the exitus reditus, right, like the return to that ordered desire as sort of one goal of the Christian experience, I think is a pretty powerful way to understand the journey. Like the Christian journey is one of desire. Right. It's one of deepening desire for God and for neighbor. And, as Jesus makes pretty clear in the Gospels, right? I mean, you love God as much as you love your neighbor, right?
Yeah, that's, I think it's, the idea that one can, what Paul talks about, this idea that, we stopped worshiping the creator and we started worshiping the creation, right? The objects were so bedazzling. And there's this thing in Girard that he gets from the Gospels about we desire the being, we desire the otherness, which is so interesting, I think, my physicist friend we have on our show, Dr. Yu, and all the time, we've been kind of working on some physics elements to this mimetic desire mystery. Mimesis, where does it come from? But like you said, ultimately, it is grounded in God, however many layers you can, scratch and see different layers of how this works. And so when I see like all these analogies in different Girardian books about magnetism, I'm like, it's not an analogy. I think it could be some kind of magnetic, physics that's going on there that's
fascinating. I'll have to listen to some of those. I think there's a lot there that's left to be. The exciting thing about mimetic theory and Girard is it feels like we're only scratching the surface, right?
That's what I'm excited about.
A lot of deep holes to go down.
If we didn't have so much crazy stuff going on in the political world, it would be such an exciting time, because I feel like we're right in the middle of just this renaissance of really interesting learning and shaking things up intellectually, and hopefully, downstream cultural change in that.
Absolutely. Crazy things in the political. I have no idea what you mean, David. Now we're speaking about a week after the Afghanistan debacle. So that Girard, said all desire eventually is metaphysical desire for being. And from a theological standpoint, that's really interesting. I mean, that means all desire is a desire for God, right? For a desire for being, being itself. And, it just calls to mind immediately for me, the phrase of Augustine, right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So that restlessness is that, that's why our desires, our mimetic desires, they feel so restless because they're not resting in the ultimate source. Yeah.
Well, I do, my theory and working with Dr. Yu is I believe that there's it's just, you have to kind of rethink some of the things about physics to get here with us. But I think that there's a magnetic component to desire. And it doesn't mean that it's all just a mechanistic thing. I do think there's God's will and there's God's agency behind that layer too, right? But when I see Jesus say, when I am lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. That's a magnet. He's a magnet for the whole world. He's a magnet of desire. And he's going to use all of our errors and our idols, and he's going to break them through history and keep drawing us to reconcile with the Lamb of God, like Revelation. And so I'm excited about the future, because I keep thinking Jesus, it says over and over again in the Old Testament, New Testament, Jesus is going to win. And I ask that to people, is Jesus going to save the world? And a lot of Christians, I understand it's a little bit more nuanced theological discussion here, but a lot of Christians have this mindset, whether they're premillennial or amillennial or whatever, they have this mindset that we're just going to go along and it's all going to go downhill. And then at some point, Jesus is going to come out like Macho Man Randy Savage with the elbow drop from the top rope at the last minute, boom, and it's on autopilot then, And it's like the idea of history is you're moving around in history, and then you get on the plane, you get on the theme park ride, and once you get in, it's on autopilot. It's going to, oh, look, here's Jesus, he's back, and the angels are here, and here's the new heaven and the earth, and it's like an autopilot thing. But I'm like, wait a second. Jesus says, you are my body, and I think Jesus is king, and I don't think he's going to lose, and we're supposed to manifest his victory in history. Mm-hmm. I think let's get to work. I mean,
and we have an important part to play in that victory. Yeah, he's given us an important part to play in the victory. And how awesome is that? But how many people believe? And I sometimes I ask people the question, well, who's the most powerful person in the world? That's friends that are serious Christians, right? A couple of years ago, Donald Trump, or they really think seriously about this, right? There's some world leader or something like that, and none of them say Jesus. It's like, right? It's what Taleb would he say? Well, you're a practical atheist then,
because that's what it means to put your trust in. Faith is about who do you trust,
right?
And if you think someone's not in power, that means you don't really trust that their way actually works. Their way of nonviolence and self-emptying works.
Yeah, I love the magnetism angle, that you're thinking deeply about. Dostoevsky, beauty will save the world. That beauty has a magnet, like an attraction, an attractive force. For a Christian, Christ's most beautiful of all. It reminds me of something James Allison said, who's a Girard scholar. He basically said, mimesis is to psychology, I would say, sort of to the soul, or to the will, even what gravity is to physics, right? So that captures like what gravity is to physics. It is a magnetism, right? When we're close in close proximity to a large object, we enter into its gravitational field, right? We're moved by it. Yeah. So I am very fascinated by that whole exploration. So man, I'll go down that rabbit hole with you time maybe.
Yeah, I mean, just to tease a little more with that, the idea is, I think if you have otherness, right? If someone has otherness, that's the opposite pole. Your opposite poles attract. So if your perception has a magnetic field to it and you perceive somebody, man, they've got that car, your perception is that's the other. That's the opposite of what I lack, that car, that wife, that house, that neighborhood, that position, that popularity. And it's that object that you perceive that makes you attracted to that opposite pole. And then as you get closer, the grass is greener on the other side effect starts to lose its luster. You start to see all the blemishes. Oh, well, they've got this and they've got that. And now you're repelled because your desire looks a lot closer to theirs than it did from far away. So as you get closer, it's a repulsion. And that's that push-pull, From far away, that looks attractive, but you get to that green hill and then you see the cow manure and you're like, I don't know, the grass was greener, but now I see all the flies and the nasty stuff and the mud and the dead animal there. Now I'm repelled by you, So I think there's a magnetic physical dimension there that we're, been working on to figure out. Because what I'm excited about is the idea of trying to unite the hard sciences and the social sciences together, to be able to build some kind of unity. And it would be awesome if Christ helps us do that. I mean, that's pretty cool, right? Putting Christ back into the conversation for understanding the physical world and how it relates to the social sciences and the social dynamics,
I'm interested in the same thing. And, that we have so much siloed thinking. Our educational system is siloed. Not a lot of people, not a lot of thinkers, not a lot of entrepreneurs that are truly interdisciplinary, the way that Girard himself was, right, that are able to pull all these things together. Social sciences, hard sciences, technology, right? Like business, like that's exciting to me, right? And bringing Christ into all of that stuff. But that's synthetic, and it requires synthetic knowledge, right, and a will to move out boldly and to do new things.
Because people are afraid, because of the cult of experts, people are afraid of going outside of their specialty. And you should do it with carefulness. You shouldn't just be a cowboy and, try to come up with some great, everybody wants to, there's the other side of you're always trying to be a guru who unites, like a cult leader or something. I've created the unified everything. And so you don't want to go there, but you have to walk that balance like Christ did and recognize that so many of the things that you think are settled, like settled science, are not. So many of the things that you read in the textbooks, this has just been disturbed. No, it's actually, it's a lot of mimetic sacredness that that the field of knowledge has imbued the founders who developed some of these theories before. And nobody, because it's like what It's like what Thomas Kuhn says. The scientists go into the field and they're not challenging the foundations of the paradigm that they've received. They're working to extend it into special detail, and empirical evidence. And it takes a kind of paradigm shift to overthrow the existing paradigm of knowledge in a given field and to create a new insight. But the problem with that is, because this is where I think Girard's helpful, is that he talks about how coercion and scapegoating holds humanity back. Mm-hmm. The more coercion and politicization we put into a field, whether it's physics or nuclear energy or whatever, the more it retards our ability to move forward with the paradigm shifts that will upset the apple cart of the reigning, heroes of the field before. You see?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, imagine if the people in social science departments at universities spent less time trying to one up each other, through mimetic rivalry, like coming up with some new. I mean, they're in like a closed framework, right? Right. Yeah. And spent less time worried about the, just scoring points within this small little world, and actually, and scapegoating each other, and actually started thinking about big questions, right? Yeah. I mean, it's that we need that in math, we need that in physics. I do think, it's kind of the whole bits and atoms debate, and I agree with that, the kind of that stagnation, in the world of atoms, because we're so small-minded in a sense, and so caught up in the petty kind of self-reinforcing systems that we've created, that are perpetuated through rivalries and through scapegoating, that we haven't like turned around and sort of like looked at the huge sort of transcendent kind of world that's out there to explore.
Yeah, I have a running theory that the reason why we haven't innovated as much in the world of atoms has to do with what I call the Mowgli effect, where the reigning physics paradigm that was on the scene at the arrival of the atom bomb. Whatever field of knowledge, whatever group of scientists could create a world-destroying fire, just like Mowgli was the one who could control fire and he ruled the jungle. And it's like, what happened was, like, the theories that were dominant at the time of the arrival of the atomic bomb got enshrined into this kind of holy of holies special place, that it didn't get enough competitive pressure to try to keep peeling and saying, wait a second, well, there could be something there, but let's go back to the basics here. Maybe we got something. No. Did you just see what they did? These are really high priests. This is world destroying power. Don't mess with those guys. If they say their theories or equations are good, let's just kind of back off a little bit. And so physics is a very, very rarefied field. And I know people come up with theories and so forth, but some of the stuff that's considered radical is still assuming so many presuppositions that may not necessarily be warranted to keep in place, but you can't do that when you have a field that is so rarefied in its power of mastery of the nature of around us,
Right. Yeah. I mean, like there's kind of almost, well, I guess you could call it gatekeepers at the top, or certain, there's credentialism involved a little bit, and there's kind of who would dare challenge, this priestly authority. Yeah.
Who are you? You need to go to our peer review papers. But if you publish in our peer review journals, you have to assume the different theories that we already assume for you to even be considered to be published in our papers. But if you don't publish in our papers, you're not accepted. See how it's that's social.
Well, it'll be interesting to see I mean, everybody's talking about decentralization with crypto and blockchain, but it'll be interesting to see when it happens there, and with stuff like that, right, where the peer reviewed journals are not where the most interesting stuff is happening. Or at least appears to be happening. Yeah.
In your exploration of Girard's understanding of the scapegoat mechanism and resurrection and everything, has it changed or modified your attitude towards death and its finality at all? Has it? Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I thought very much about that, other than, I mean, I take my, Girard said that, he wasn't saying anything new, really. It's all in the Gospels. And, in terms of answering that question, sort of my view of death and resurrection comes from there. I don't know if Girard has necessarily added anything other than the worldly resurrection of scapegoats as a form of, of divinity. I see that, right?
Right.
I see that. I wonder what's going to happen with Trump, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of fascinating political questions there, but on a theological level, not really.
Well, for me, just my perspective, when I first encountered his book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, and I'm reading the stuff about the resurrection, I felt that little, I mean, maybe it's just me doubting Thomas. I want the faith, but I also want a little bit of evidence, I always want to, can I get some scientific like evidence or something just to give me a little assurance? Because, always wrestling with these things. Help me, I believe, help me with my unbelief, right? That idea. And when I saw, the first time, I'm like, okay, so wait a second. He's showing that all these myths and all these culture are based on these dying and rising gods. And they're preserved in these different texts that are cultures that are not interacting with each other. And then there's this one. And the evidence that it's a real resurrection is the schism. And that was like a whoa. That was like I don't want to say this in a flippant way, but it's almost like you can feel the fingerprints of divinity and history with that story. Like seeing it a little bit, you're touching it. And I know people get wary of that because they want to say, no, you can't prove resurrection scientifically or with evidence or historical arguments. But I felt like that was a really good, he was laying down the foundations for the beginning of a nice apologetic in defense of the historical reality of the resurrection, which is like, wait, that's interesting. If his theory is correct, right, that all these cultures are bound up in this complete unity based on this sacrificial dying and rising God pattern. And then here's one that reverses that and it creates schism. That's kind of an evidence. If that's correct, that would be evidence that something real happened here that was beyond humans at the very least.
I see what you're saying. And I agree. And I allude to that in Wanting in chapter 4. Like this was different in so many ways. I mean, the post-resurrection accounts in the Gospels, they're different than anything you're going to see in any of the pagan mythology. They're weird. There's a corporality to the resurrection. They don't quite recognize the Lord. And it does that. What you said is the most important point, that rather than unify, it almost immediately caused division. Right. And critical to understand that, because that is not, think about it, right? I mean, like it's almost like embarrassing from the standpoint, like it's such an odd thing, right? If you were going to mythologize this, right? Like, right. Why would you include all of these inconvenient details of the story? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right, because it's like, why do you guys make yourselves look so wrong the whole time? If you're, the gospel writers, these guys are pretty, they try to make this myth, but it's so dumb to do that, because you look at that and you're like, this is so beyond that. They're not making themselves look good. They make themselves look bad. They make themselves look totally obstinate and stupidly wrong on so many levels. They're spending time with him every day for 3 years, and they get it wrong over and over and over again. And they get it wrong when it really matters for them to get it right. And it's beyond just a mythic, proselytizing text trying to sell you on a new thing. It's something that's bedazzling and confronts and undermines and almost humiliates the people who are pushing this message, because they don't, it's a very humble thing what they're saying. Peter, and all these folks that are getting it wrong. And then you, like you said, and what's interesting is Jesus predicts that. He says, I've come to bring a sword. And then he brings a sword, because you got all these false resurrections. And yet at the beginning of the Gospels, you get the one with the false resurrection of John the Baptist. And that's it's like a contrast to the true resurrection story later on. But everywhere that story goes, it comes with a sword. That's why we're fighting today over who's the most victim. Who's the most, I'm a victim, you're a victim. We're fighting over who's the most, because we are all coveting the martyr's perch of Christ. We want to be on I tell people we want the postcard crucifixion. Those signs where they have the little cutout of your head at the fair, and you can put your face in, look, I'm on the cross. That's how we are today. We all want to put up, hey, look, I'm the martyr because of my identity or my oppression, my hurt. And it's like, we're all fighting for that because we recognize there's like a nuclear power with that. and it's breaking societies apart exactly as Jesus predicted. So that to me is another apologetic piece of support for the historicity of what the Bible claims happened, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, most people speak about the Bible as, these are just, they speak about it like a mythology, and the key here is the resurrection of the body, I think, right. in the resurrection, because that destroys this kind of dualistic mindset. If there was no encounter with a inconvenient encounter with a resurrected Lord, then this could just be sort of like whatever we wanted it to be.
Right.
According to our own kind of mythology and idea, Jesus was just a teacher, good guy who had these ideas about, how to be better humans. That's entirely different than the resurrected Lord who, the apostles had to encounter. And that's a really, really important piece. I think without the resurrection of the incarnation is the fundamental, right, to Christianity. And that includes the resurrection of the body. And without that piece of the post-resurrection accounts and the resurrection, if it was just a spiritual resurrection, the apostles just felt in their hearts that Jesus was alive, and they just no, right? Yeah. It's not that. It's that there was Christianity does concern itself with matter, right? With it's an incarnate, right, religion. And we can just over spiritualize it. And this goes right back to the beginning of our conversation, I think, right? We were talking about, well, what do we do? Like we have to be concerned with matter, right? Because that's what the resurrection of the body sounds like. Well, the body's important.
Well, that's what the woke stuff is, a Christian heresy that's kind of going back to Gnosticism, where the body doesn't matter. It's about words. And these language codes that they construct, language is violence, and we're going to socially construct language that gets revenge on the violent structure of language that we're all under. So it's this battle of words. It reminds me of mythology, right? Because mythology conceals hidden victims, because people can go along and say, well, I'm using politically correct language, so it doesn't matter who we cage for a nonviolent crime. It doesn't matter what war we go off to. It doesn't matter if we dehumanize our political opponents, because the body doesn't matter. You can be whatever you want. There's a denigration of the body, I think, in this kind of late stage liberalism we call woke or whatever. I think it's kind of like this Christian Gnostic, super Christianity, as Gerard would say, that we need, the way we counter that is by saying, no, they are flesh and blood victims and their bodies matter, and treating them, even if you disagree with them, you don't believe, you voted for the wrong guy, so we can put you in solitary confinement for months.
Right.
That's a hatred of the body there, right?
Right. When there's a dualistic mindset, then you can say anything you want, and it's hard to be held accountable for it, because you're not grappling with the objective reality of matter, of the world, right? You don't have to actually deal with it. And that's the case in a lot of different domains. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that dualism, which is kind of the heart of Gnosticism is fundamentally dualistic. It's just that the mind is separate from the body. Then all kinds of, talk about an escalation to extremes, right? It's almost like a mimetic escalation of abstractions, right? Because when you're in the world of abstractions, where does that end? There's no end. Right. You just keep going.
Microaggressions and, mansplaining. What is mansplaining? These are all just abstractions that put our eyes away from the sacredness of the human body, no matter who it is. If you're obsessed with microaggressions, then you can do terrible things like we see happening to fetuses born alive and they're using organs or whatever. It's horrible. You have to think about the body as primary, and that's what Christianity brings to the world. So, hey, I really appreciate this discussion. What would you say, for folks who want to, they're interested in checking this book out? What do you want them to experience or come away with when they read Wanting?
I want them to experience the book at a personal existential level, and I tried to recreate a bit of my own experience with the book, the arc of the book, kind of a dark descent and then kind of a journey out. So I want readers to not just, come away with some new ideas and fancy words that they can, talk about on social media. I want them to have come away changed, at some level, or at least thinking more seriously about what human desire is, where it comes from, what it's for, and why it matters. And, I think, in awareness, I think Girard is one of the most important thinkers to understand. And, if a few more people are aware of his thinking and dive deeper into the primary sources, I mean, that's one of my hopes, right? Is that, the book is just a gateway into a lot of amazing stuff out there, because people have been writing and talking about Girard for, over 60 years now. So that's really my hope.
Well, very good. Check out Wanting: The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life by Luke Burgis. Thank you for joining me, Luke. Great discussion.
Thanks for having me, David. Yep. Thank you so much.